South Africa, and one where hopefully we can make significant advances in all of our struggles to improve social justice and to advance equality and to fight for and promote accountability and good governance. So we just took advantage. I saw Jay last week, and Jay mentioned that Comrade Sinara and Sergio are here from Brazil. Jay will introduce them properly. But we're all looking for answers, and we're all looking to learn from other experiences of social movements and governments, particularly in other developing and middle-income countries. And Brazil is often held up as an example of something that we can learn from. I'm sure it is something.
Thanks, Mark, and good year to you all. Sergio is someone I've known for 23 years. Was someone I met in 1991. And in 1991, if I can characterize the period, we had seen in the 80s the emergence of very powerful unions that later formed into COSATU. But it was a different form of unionism. It was a social movement, political unionism that was very militant, that was very strongly organized at the point of production, and that was built on the workers' struggles against very high levels of capitalist exploitation. If you look at the emergence of the union movement in Brazil and in South Africa, it came about in the same period. And basically it developed a strand of unionism that was characterized by an independence. An independence that really was written into the DNA of the organizations. And it was an independence that understood the importance of political alliances and embraced political aspirations of the poor and the working class, but actually we're not conveyor belts of political parties. Now, Senaro Porto Fajardo is a human rights activist, basically coming from the Rio Grande do Sul state, which is in the south, based in Porto Alegre, and as you understand, Porto Alegre also hosted the World Social Forum for its first 3 years. So it'll be interesting hearing from her about where is this social forum today. But also her focus has been about social control, about how do citizens engage with the state? A very critical question for us here in South Africa. What are the challenges facing Brazil today? What are the lessons, both the successes and the failures? And reflect on what's happening in Brazil today. We've all seen on our TV screens the big protests in Rio and Sao Paulo. What does this mean? What is it telling us today about the state of politics in Brazil and what lessons it could offer us here in South Africa? So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Sergio.
2013 was a very important year for Brazil. It was the 25th year that we celebrate our new constitution. As you also had your new constitution here in South Africa in '96, we had our new constitution in 1988. But the new constitution was drafted before we had the first presidential elections, which is strange, but that's how it works between Brazil and South Africa. Sometimes your guys are ahead of us, and sometimes we're ahead of you. So it's very funny and interesting to see how each of our countries move forward. Well, we have some good success stories. Lula promised that he would create 10 million jobs. During the campaign, I was thinking, oh my goodness, 10 million jobs. We just came out from a neoliberal government. We were just having an average of the last 80 years before Lula went into government. We had just an average growth rate in the economy of 2%. How are you going to create 10 million jobs? So the matter is that it's a long story. I can't tell it here. He made some changes in the economy, not radical changes. Lula, there was no ideology. Lula's main government program, the first one was the Zero Hunger Program. So we have to work to end with hunger in the country because millions of people in Brazil were still starving. So that was the main focus of the beginning of his government. And the second important thing in terms the economy. So he would give it. So with that, he created the Bolsa Familia. The Bolsa Familia is the family stipend. And that's family stipend. Maybe if you ask questions during the discussions, where I can explain a little bit more, because otherwise I'll stay here talking forever, and there's no time for that, and I don't want to do that. So the Bolsa Familia, the family stipend, was a great success. So we had 30 million people lifted from absolute poverty. These were people that were living below the poverty line. And so they were lifted above the poverty line, just getting $70 a month from the government, but the conditionality was that all the children have to have their vaccines, so they will have to have their vaccines book always updated for their children. They will have to be enrolled in school if they had already, if they had the schooling age, they will have to enroll their children in school. And the mothers, if the mothers got pregnant, they would have also to attend doctor exams and all that, all those pre-delivery exams that women have to do. So these were the three conditionalities for getting the grant of the Bolsa Familia, the family stipend. It was so everybody got a magnetic card, like an ATM card, and it's the woman, the mother, that got the card, because the mother, they thought, has much more responsibility than some men that drink and spend money with other things. So they would give the card to the mother, and so she would go directly to a federal savings. We have 3 federal state-owned banks in Brazil, which also makes a difference in our economy. And she would go directly to the bank, put it in the machine, ATM machine, and she would get the grant with no political interference. So this was another success story in Lula's government. We opened credit lines. Brazil was a country that only lended money for people that need money to borrow. So only rich, upper middle class people would borrow money, but they don't need money. So we had a very limited credit system in Brazil. So Lula opened that up. It was an idea that came from the unions, because now we're aging the population. So we have already 13, 15 million people that are now retirees. Many of them get the minimum wage. The minimum wage in Brazil is around $350 a month. So these people would have no access to credit, so they can't buy consumer goods, electric appliances, nothing. So the CUT, which is like the COSATU in South Africa, took to Lula this idea. Why not lend against the paycheck? So the paycheck, because these people don't have no collateral to give to the banks. So the collateral for that loan would be the paycheck. Now about the flaws, there are many flaws. There are a lot of success stories, but there are many flaws. What would be the flaws? The first one is that we did not manage to move forward with our land reform. We have millions of people that need land in Brazil, different from South Africa, that want to work the lands. And they do not have access to land, because in Brazil, land is highly concentrated in the hands of very few people. Very few people are owners of millions of hectares. I'm talking about millions of hectares. Brazil has 270 million hectares of arable land. So you can imagine the size of the country, 270 million hectares of land. And the majority of the land is concentrated in the hands of big landowners. So we have a very radical social movement that is not as radical as it was in the past and not as strong as in the past. But that's another issue that we'll try to discuss in the discussion, which is the landless workers movement. The MST is the acronym in Portuguese. So they've been fighting they occupy land, and that creates a problem. They send the police, they send the armies, the other government, not during our new government. But it has not managed to move forward. Why not? But this is a more radical view. I am a radical guy in theory, but I understand that the reality is more complicated, especially when you're in government. We both have been in government, which is a bad idea, because I'm a non-government guy, so staying in government for several years was not a very good idea for me. But anyway, so we should have undertaken a political reform. What do I mean by political reform? This is something that you suffered here too. In Brazil, you have free public campaigning on television and radio for 2 months, free all parties. And that's good, because our media is privatized, it's controlled, so we have that. But for leafletting, rallies, traveling around, private companies can fund the politicians and the candidates. So we have private funding in Brazil, and that's very bad. Because of course, The companies, they will, as we say, we have a saying, you light up a candle to God and light up a candle to the devil. So that's what they do. They support right-wing and left-wing candidates. Whoever wins, they'll be in their pockets or they'll try to influence them. So we should have undertaken a political reform for public funding. That's being discussed now in Brazil, public funding. And we should also bring the movement, there was those labor notes guys in Detroit, bring the movement back to the labor movement. We need to bring back the movement to the movements in Brazil.
And I think that's one really interesting debate we should be having here in South Africa. Are we building movements? Or are there any movements in this country that replicate or come close to the social movements that we're connecting each other in the 80s? Is there something so different in the circumstances that face us today that we cannot do that? Is there lessons we can take from there? Is there new ways of building movements? There's big debate about, social media today, but is movements on social media? What are the strengths and weaknesses of that? And what is the combination between old style organizing, which we did in the 80s, and the mobilization of social media? So I think let's reflect a bit on this, and it's also a conversation between us and South Africans. Okay, we've got about an hour to have a discussion, so let's keep it free-flowing, not long speeches. Let's keep it very focused and maybe relevant to what are the challenges that face us here. Both countries are now going into an election campaign, and obviously there's going to be a lot of promises put on the table by political parties. I think Sergio talked about political reform. It'll be interesting to have a bit of a discussion about what political reform means here, even here in this country, and compare it to that. I think the second thing is, everything is wonderful on paper. How do we implement what we are saying? And what I think Comrade Sanara is saying is, even with the best intention, with the best comrades, there are always weaknesses in the implementation, and you lose your constituency. And I think one very important thing about us in South Africa is, how do we get people engaged? Activism, no transformation is driven just by activists. Activists are peer catalysts. If people do not feel it is their issue, they'll either vote for, as in that case, for an opposition party, or not vote at all. And I think that's one really interesting debate we should be having here in South Africa. Are we building movements? Or are there any movements in this country that replicate or come close to the social movements that we're connecting each other in the 80s? Is there something so different in the circumstances that face us today that we cannot do that? Is there lessons we can take from there? Is there new ways of building movements? There's big debate about social media today, but is movements on social media? What are the strengths and weaknesses of that? And what is the combination between old style organizing, which we did in the 80s, and the mobilization of social media? So I think let's reflect a bit on this, and it's also a conversation between us and South Africa.